Welcome to a new episode of Product Directions Podcast, 100 Product Strategies. We are your insider access to top product leaders shaping the strategy of the most diverse industries today. I'm your host, Nacho Basino, and I'll be digging into the real-life situations, problems, and frameworks used for strategy with product people all around the world in all kinds of products and markets. While there is no recipe for success, listening to others' experiences may give you the edge you need to solve your next strategic challenge. Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode. Today I'm with Thor Mitchell, so I'm really happy because he has been in product for many years. He probably has some great stories to share. He's currently head of product at Miro, because also was an ex-Googler. So Thor, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Good to be here.
Maybe give a proper introduction of yourself and your work to the audience. Can you tell us a bit about your background and what you have been doing lately?
Sure, yeah. So I moved into product back in late 2009. So I guess 14 years ago almost now. At that time I was working at Google in Sydney. I was a support engineer for Google's Maps API, helping paying customers. And I've been doing that for a couple of years down there. My background is sort of somewhat technical. I didn't study software engineering, computer science, but I was always messing about with computers and have been working in that space since university. And I got the opportunity to rotate into the Maps API team as the PM. That went well and became a permanent thing. And then I spent another 5 years at Google in Australia and in the US, focused on product management for developer products, various developer products. And then moved back to the UK, where I'm from, in 2015, joined a startup there in the equity crowdfunding space as their head of product and then CPO. So that's really where I learned how to sort of build and lead teams. Spent a couple of years after that. So I was with CrowdQ for 3.5 years, and then spent a couple of years just doing consulting and coaching, mostly of heads of product and CPOs at early stage startups in the UK and Europe, before being introduced to Miro and joining full-time about 3 years ago. To build and lead this team. And we are responsible for building the SDKs and APIs we offer external developers, vendors, and partners to build apps and integrations on Miro or that include Miro, in addition to teams that are building strategic integrations with the largest partners we have. So exactly the companies you would expect, like Google, Microsoft, Slack, and so on. I have a team of about 15 people, which is made up of product managers, technical writers, developer advocates, program managers. And in addition to working on the platform integrations here at Miro, I'm also the founded and lead Miro's new APM program. So we just started a new graduate recruitment program for product managers based here in Amsterdam. And we onboarded our first 2 APMs just a few weeks ago.
Super cool. That's super cool. Well, that's very interesting because the type of product you are working on, I think it's quite different. And I guess that it requires some different strategic thinking that the guests I usually have in the podcast. So I would love to start by getting an introduction on the last time you were building the strategy for your product, how it went, maybe some of the process, or walk us through the process you went through.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is I've learned, especially at a company that is growing as quickly and moving as fast as Miro, that your strategy is not a fixed moment in time. It's a continually evolving thing. You're continually learning, and the environment is changing. The competitive landscape is changing. The resources available at your disposal are changing, and so we don't so much have. It's not so much that we had a moment in time where we did a strategy. We actually try and refresh or update the strategy about every 6 months. And we found that's the cadence we need in order to accurately reflect the changes that are happening around us. I think some teams would definitely struggle with that. We do see some people find that a bit disorientating, this sense that the strategy is not fixed. And I think that's why communicating the strategy kind of regularly and clearly is so important, to make people feel comfortable that they know, how we're approaching the problems we're trying to solve. Strategy is almost a continuous process. The last sort of formal update I gave, for example, was back in March, and we're planning another one for October. And I think in terms of how we go about it, it's something that has definitely evolved over time as we've succeeded and built the team and understood the problem space and understood how strategy is interpreted or received within the organization. So it's not just about what the strategy is, it's also just as much about how you package it, how you communicate it. Can you align on shared language? Can you make sure that you can illustrate it effectively with examples or case studies and so on? And then in terms of how we went about it, so the first thing I'd say is that building a strategy for a developer platform is definitely a little bit different from a conventional B2C or even B2B strategy. There are two main sort of, I would say, categories of platform, and strategy is quite different for the two of them. One is where the platform is the product. So effectively, you are building services for developers that you will offer them in exchange for money. Right? So these are the sort of the classic platform plays like Stripe or Twilio. To some extent, actually, the Maps API was in this category. I know at that time when I was working on it back in 2010 and so on, direct monetization was not a significant component of the strategy, but it was a set of services that enable you to add mapping to your product. It was not an API to the Google Maps consumer product, if you see what I mean. It wasn't allowing you to interact with the consumer product. It was a standalone set of libraries for building mapping applications. So that is, in some respects, a relatively conventional strategy challenge. You need to figure out what the market needs, what developers need. You need to understand how you differentiate yourself from other platforms in the same space, and you need to figure out your pricing, what your sort of value generation model is almost, and how you balance the value. I'm not suggesting that's easy, not at all. It's something that we definitely struggled with at various times, but it's a reasonably well understood motion, if you like.
Yeah.
And it was a real learning experience for me to come to Miro, where we needed to build a platform around an existing product. So rather than the platform being the product, we have an existing B2C and B2B product, and the platform needs to support the underlying business goals of that product. And that raises some very interesting strategy questions, because when you're looking to build a platform to sell services to developers, then the value exchange is very clear. The value proposition is very clear. Right? You just have to solve problems that developers have, and in a way that for a reasonable price point, I guess. Whereas one of the first challenges we face when building a platform around a product is, what are the incentives for developers to engage? What is in it for them? Like, the value to the business is relatively clear. We are keen to see more companies, more vendors, more partners, and more developers building apps and integrations on Miro that expand the set of use cases that Miro can cater to, that solve challenges or problems or meet customer needs that Miro is not currently focused on, that increase the penetration of Miro into businesses and the extent to which the deployments of Miro are tailored to the needs of our customers in ways that both add value and improve retention. But why should the other side of the equation participate in that activity? What is in it for them? And that has been is actually quite an interesting challenge, because it's a real chicken and egg problem. There are certainly a significant number of developers and organizations that would love to have a channel to access the customers of Miro and offer them services and solutions and build a reputation for doing innovative work in the collaboration space. But you have to solve the problem of without a good set of apps, it's hard to attract users to your marketplace. And without a good set of users, it's hard to attract developers to build apps. And so this is the heart of the problem that you're trying to crack.
Yeah. And by the way, I was going back to the value for the business, because you kind of in the wording, it's very easy to understand that value, but when you try to put targets to that, so let's say, for example, you say, hey, we cover use cases that the Miro core team will not cover, or things like that, That tends, I mean, at least I imagine that will be hard to measure at some point.
Absolutely. Success metrics is something that keeps me up at night.
Okay.
I talked about how the strategy has evolved over time, and that one of the challenges is ensuring that the team who are building this platform, and that's approaching 100 people cross-functionally when you include design, engineering, marketing, partnerships, and a number of other functions, that everybody is able to keep aligned with the strategy as it evolves. That's a big challenge. Another challenge we've had that's very similar to that is, how do you quantify your success? And the reason it's similar is because, again, it's an iterative learning process. We try different metrics, we see how effective they are, and in some cases they're not that effective and we have to change them. And changing success metrics is extremely disorientating for teams, right? They like to understand how is their success measured, both as a team and as individuals. And if you're saying, actually, we're going to change this, and you're doing it frequently because you're continually evaluating new options, as we have been, it can be difficult to manage. And the reason it's difficult is, there's a couple of reasons, actually. One of the reasons is that metrics have multiple purposes, right? Like, why do we have metrics? That's a reasonable question to ask, is why do we have metrics? It's sort of taken as a given that you should, of course, but if you actually sort of think about why that is, there's both actually understanding the progress you're making and tracking how effectively the product interventions you're performing are impacting the behaviors that you need to drive, and the value you're looking to generate. And there is also, how do you reflect the value of the work you're doing outwards through the organization and upwards into the leadership, in order to justify the investment the business is making, maybe additional headcount or support in other ways. And it might sound like those two things, can be consolidated. That if you can set a good North Star metric that that can work for both the team and for the leadership and the larger organization. The reason that's particularly difficult for platforms is that the core value that you're looking to generate for the business, that metric is extremely laggy. It's laggy in the order of 9 to 12 months, kind of laggy, right? Because let's imagine that you are executing on a product strategy to drive developer acquisition. So your goal is to attract more people to build apps and integrations on your platform. So that's a top of the funnel challenge for your developer funnel. So you think there's two funnels, effectively, the developer funnel and the user funnel, if you like. It's a two-sided marketplace. And the value generation that happens for the business is when users use these apps and integrations. Right? That's actually where the value is realized. So in order for that to happen, let's say I begin a marketing campaign to attract more developers. So let's presume that campaign works, and that I do succeed in acquiring more developers. So more developers come to my developer site, they learn about the platform, they recognize some utility in the platform, they start to learn about the platform, they build their first sort of hello world app, then they recognize a use case, then they go ahead and actually build out a use case, then they publish that use case and distribute it, then companies have to engage with it and adopt it, and then users get to start using it. It takes a very long time, right, to go through that whole journey of acquiring developers and activating them, engaging them in app development, distribution, publishing, and adoption. So, but it's that adoption that is the business value. If the business is trying to understand why are we doing this, they want to see more customers engaging with the apps and integrations. The developer ecosystem is extremely valuable to the business, but it's without wanting to seem in any way dismissive of our community, it's a means to an end as far as the leadership are concerned. They're looking, they're looking to get more apps and integrations built that add value to the product and add value for customers. So those are the metrics they are focused on. They're focused on those sort of adoption metrics at the end of the user funnel. Whereas at the early stages of building the platform, which is where we have been for the last few years, we are still very much focused at the top of the developer funnel, right? Yeah. So we have to separate those two things out. We have to have leading metrics that the team can use to understand the progress we're making against our overall strategy. And then we have to have like a long-term North Star, which is the business value we're generating. And and teasing those things apart and figuring out what the right balance is quite difficult, because some of the metrics that we have tried, considered using to represent progress, just don't move very quickly, and can be very stubborn, right? They're sort of metrics that can be like very flat for a long time, and then they'll take a sudden jump, and then they'll be and it's really not helpful for understanding, is our strategy working? It's not helpful for driving morale through the team that we're making progress, right? So finding the right sort of collection of metrics and deciding which you share inside the team and which you share outside the team, definitely something that we're on a continuous learning journey with.
Interesting. And maybe to explore that a bit more, I want to know about how you're actually making these decisions, if it's working or not. I mean, I assume this is at some point in the product leadership shoulders to say, hey, the leading metric indicator that we choose is helping our lagging indicator that the business will choose. And what are the sort of, so I guess that this 6 month feedback loop is the one that you are expecting to see some progress to iterate it?
Yeah. So we have, the way we're structured is that we have a sort of cross-functional leadership team for this developer platform and integrations part of the business. So I have, as head of product, I have a counterpart who's a head of engineering, I have a head of design, crucially, a head of data analytics. So we're fortunate enough to actually have a dedicated data analytics function, which is obviously something I haven't had the luxury of when I was at a startup. And that has, changed my life, because like having people who deeply understand the data pipeline and can go really deep in understanding the quality of the metrics and the accuracy of the metrics has been incredibly helpful to really understand whether we're monitoring the right things and whether the data we're looking at is data we can have confidence in. And it's surprisingly nuanced, right? Things that you might think are relatively easy metrics to measure turn out to be quite difficult to measure. For example, one of the metrics, unsurprisingly, that we monitor is we call engaged developers. How many people are actively developing on the platform right now? Sounds simple, but in reality, it's quite difficult to accurately distinguish between development activity that's occurring as a result of new app development versus platform activity that's occurring due to the use of apps that have been published and released. Both of those things generate the same traffic to us. Actually, one of the issues we've had in the past is how do we distinguish between people who are developing apps and people who have developed apps? And so that we know who the truly engaged developers are. And to go into that requires you to really think about what are the kind of the relevant behaviors, what are the key indicators? Are you seeing traffic primarily to a sandbox or to a production environment? Are you seeing heavy use of new APIs versus APIs that are perhaps older or been around for a long time? And there are various other factors we can look into to understand this in more detail. But it does mean that if we'd have just taken some of the early metrics at face value because we didn't have that expertise in the team, we would have been completely misled.
Very interesting. It's very interesting. Unfortunately, not very replicable to some product leaders out there without the function, but at least not taking it at face value and doing some extra research. That's a good point to consider. One thing that I'm struggling with in my head of what you just told us is that you have these very lagging indicators of success, but on the other hand, you have kind of a 6 month cycle for the strategy. So I'm wondering, how are you selecting the insights, or how actually, we were discussing how measure success of the strategy, but since you are changing the strategy before you actually see the kind of long-term impact of the thing, how is this, how are the insights that feed into your strategy coming up, or maybe some example that we can explore?
Yeah. So I'd say two things on that. One is, as I mentioned, we do maintain a set of metrics internal to the team that are much more leading. So we do look at developer acquisition, developer activation. Similarly, on the user side, we also look at that. We have a whole conversion funnel because again, another interesting element of being an enterprise SaaS platform is the amount of time we spend building tooling for enterprise admins to manage the deployment of apps within their organization. And so it's not like we don't have the fortune of the sort of user adoption funnel that, say, a mobile phone platform has, like iOS or Android or something like that, where you obviously you have a marketplace, you're marketing your apps in that marketplace, and you look at user adoption based on installs. A large proportion of our installs, in quotes, actually occur because an app is deployed company-wide by an admin, but that will only happen if the business recognizes a need for this app, if the company trusts the organization that's developed that app, and various other factors at play. So we have to look at, like, our user funnel is quite complex, and then we have the developer funnel, and we have metrics that we look at all the way down through the funnel. So we do get some early indicators when things are responding to work we're doing, which is great. But I will admit that we perhaps rely a little more on qualitative feedback than you might do in some other roles, where we go out and we talk to developers, we talk to partners, we talk to solution partners, companies that have experience both on our platform, but also experience working on platforms of other large collaboration solutions that are operating with a similar audience, to actually understand what their expectations are, what state of the art is today, and where the pain points are, and so forth. And we have to sort of, to some extent, take it on faith that if we address the feedback that we get from our customers, that will result in a long-term benefit.
Yeah, interesting. But that gets me back to, or maybe the thing I'm now trying to figure out is, I assume you have some part of kind of let's call it improving the SDKs and the tools you give to developers to kind of develop more things, but also the management of the marketplace or whatever terms is there. Would you say that the strategy is about balancing those, or do you have a stronger focus on one or the other, or both are equally important?
There's definitely an art to identifying the key levers to be pulling at any given time. And it's not consistent over time. So somewhat oversimplistic, but a kind of model that we use is we effectively have four main areas that we're focused on. There's sort of top of the funnel for users, top of the funnel for developers, and then like kind of mid and bottom of the funnel for users and developers. And what I mean by that is, top of the funnel for developers is our ability to acquire developers and activate them, which means get them to our developer site, get them to try the platform for the first time. The middle of the funnel, as it were, and the end, the middle is really, okay, what use cases can we actually enable developers and partners to build apps and integrations around? And that is a function of the capabilities of the SDKs and APIs that we offer. So as with most platforms, we're not yet at the stage where 100% of the overall Miro product is platformized, right? We have a finite number of people working on that. We have to pick the features that we think will unlock the largest number of use cases. And then at the bottom of the funnel is like distribution for developers. So how does apps actually get into the hands of users? Is it shared privately within businesses, or do they publish it on our marketplace, in which case we have a review process that they have to go through to make sure that they're well-designed, secure, respect privacy, use data correctly, and all these other factors that are really important, particularly in an enterprise environment. And then on the user side, excuse me, at the top of the funnel is about app discoverability, right? So how do we actually surface the right apps to the right users at the right time to address real-world challenges and needs that they have? That, again, very difficult problem, especially early in the platform where you don't have a very large set of apps to choose from. And once you have piqued their interest, let's put it that way, then you have to look at what is the onboarding process of a user. So many of these apps have to take users through an authentication or authorization flow. There's also sort of an app life cycle in terms of how, as a user, you understand how to launch an app, how to get back to it, whether it's still running, and so on. And then obviously retention is important. So how do you make sure that people who've used an app once are able to get back to it easily again when they need it? So there's like four main kind of problem areas that we have to tackle. And we have different teams working in different parts of that overall map. And so the challenge, as you said, is to figure out, especially in the current macroeconomic environment where headcount is being kind of responsibly managed, which bets do we place? Where do we focus our attention at any given time? And there's a general sort of best practice that we follow that's taken more from the PLG side of the business, which is don't invest in the top of the funnel while the bottom is leaking. Right. So don't. In other words, don't throw money after trying to acquire users or developers when you can't retain them. And so we have spent quite a lot of time on both the developer experience. So what is the process of educating developers, the tooling, app management, all of these pieces that relate to enabling developers to be productive. Everything they need other than the APIs and SDKs. We've invested a lot in that to make sure that if you come to the platform, you have a good experience and you want to stay. And then on the user side, we've invested or continue to invest in reducing the overall friction of adopting apps, be that at the company level or at the individual level. So again, if you actually are interested in an app, you can get to the point where you're using it very quickly and easily without being caught up in a lot of sort of administrative red tape. But the plan is always that once we feel that those two pieces are where we want them to be, then the emphasis will shift. In fact, I would argue on the developer side, it's already starting to shift back towards top of the funnel, where we have confidence, we have a strong and healthy funnel. Now we just need to figure out how to pour people into it. And that will change our priorities, absolutely.
Interesting. That's a good reason to change the strategy. One thing I'm kind of in this, going back to the marketplace chicken and egg problem, I think that in this case you have two really strong sources of need. So you may have users saying, "Hey, I want to see this tool that I use. I want to see the integration in Miro," and you may have developers for the same reason saying, "Hey, I need this capability to build a tool that can integrate to Miro too." So how do you reconcile these options? Is this again a balancing act, or do you have some sort of prioritization, some principle, or something like that guides that logic?
This actually comes back to sort of where we started to some extent, which is that because we are a platform that supports the overall success of the product, we try not to have a totally independent strategy. I mean, it's tempting. It's tempting to say, well, how do we make the platform successful? But ultimately, it's important that we understand our role in the business, and defining an independent platform strategy from the core product strategy would just result in unnecessary tension internally. So to sort of answer your question, obviously we do listen to our customers, we do listen to our developers, but particularly in the early stages when we're still relatively young, the platform's relatively young, we don't have a huge developer community, nothing like, when I started working on Google Maps, the API for Google Maps, when I first started working on it, there was about 75,000 developers using it worldwide already. By the time I moved off, it was 1.1 million developers were using it. So I was drowning in feedback. Right? I never had to. I didn't realize how lucky I was. It was my first product role. And this was sort of 2009, 2010. So product management was still an evolving discipline. The Church of Marty Kagan was not was not meeting regularly, and so I didn't appreciate the importance of discovery and research early on because I just had so much feedback to work from. And it wasn't until later in my career when I started working on earlier stage platforms and then went and worked at a startup that I really understood the importance of getting out there and talking to your customers and learning from them. And so that's where we are on the platform journey to some extent, is we get some good feedback, but mostly we have to go and solicit it rather than it coming to us inbound. And so in terms of how we set priorities, we do listen to that, but we try to reconcile it with the larger business strategy. So what are the audiences that the company is targeting? What are the use cases the company is targeting for Miro as a whole? And how do we ensure that we are enabling our partners and developers to to build apps and integrations that align with those audiences, that will serve their needs and that align with our use cases, so that we don't create tension between the stories that our partners and developers are telling, or the users they're trying to attract, or the use cases they're trying to serve, and those that the business is trying to prioritize, and therefore all the messaging that comes through in our marketing and other go-to-market activities. Now, having said that, just to be completely transparent, there are some developers who have made a conscious decision to tackle the empty space, to explicitly go after audiences and use cases that we are not going after. They see that as an interesting opportunity to cater to personas that Miro is not focused on. It also reduces the risk that their apps end up competing with first-party features that we build later, which is always challenging in a platform. But in making that choice, they understand that they're taking on more of a responsibility around the go-to-market side. They have to build their own audience. They have to tell their own story, because it doesn't necessarily align directly with ours. So they are making a calculated risk there. And we're supportive of that, as long as they understand that that's the relationship they're in.
Yeah, but that's super interesting. Sounds like a very interesting win-win scenario, because probably them doing that also helps you, because you can indirectly target those audiences and don't allow them to go to the competitors or whatever, because you have the use case covered by another party. So
that's the theory. Yes, it's too soon to say how that works out, but that is exactly the ambition.
Yeah. Great. I want to change gears a little bit, because we went deep into challenges that were really interesting, but I'm missing the kind of the picture on I would say the process or the steps. Because for example, let's say it's March again, and you are starting. What's the first thing you're doing? Since it's evolving, are you evaluating the current strategy, or how the process starts, and what's the kind of the first steps?
Yeah, and the first step is to revisit the vision, as it were.
Okay.
We have a practice here at Miro called Painted Pictures, which is where you tell the story of how the product is going to evolve over time. So we have a platform painted picture. It is, interestingly, the last one I wrote, it was inspired a little bit by Amazon's working backwards methodology. It wasn't a press release as such, but it was sort of a executive update from the future. So I said, let's suppose I was sitting down in 2 years' time and I was writing a summary for executives as to the state of the platform. What would I want that to say? And that's how I went about kind of creating this painted picture, which helps us sort of align over the longer term goals and opportunities that we see. Then, as I mentioned, we break it down into these 4 areas, and we look at, okay, within that, there are within those 4 areas, there are certain initiatives which are I was going to say strategic, but that's a bit of a tautologist
Meta level
strategy. There are certain initiatives which we believe have the potential to significantly move the metrics and significantly move us forward in terms of of our progress towards that.
One question before continuing.
Yeah.
Where are these initiatives coming from? Is this something that you have a pool of things that have been considered in the past and now are being revisited?
It comes from a lot of the discovery conversations that I mentioned a moment ago.
Perfect.
So it's a hybrid of understanding the customer needs and the developer needs, understanding, but also looking at the primary use cases the business is focused on, and understanding how the platform needs to evolve to support those as well. But what's interesting is we realized that we needed to more explicitly distinguish between those, what you might call big bets, right? The big rocks, the things that we think have real potential, from the things that are necessary but not sufficient. In other words, there's a significant amount of work that you need to do to build a platform, which is non-negotiable. You have to do it, but doing it is not going to make the difference between success and failure. Not doing it could cause you to fail, but doing it is just meets the requirements, and then investing beyond that is probably not going to give you. It's going to give you a poor return. And so, we talked earlier about trying to give you a few good examples. So, for example, one of the things that's absolutely essential, like absolutely critical to the success of a platform is documentation, right? It's good developer documentation. What's interesting is if you don't have documentation or your documentation is poor, you will struggle. You'll struggle to attract developers and get apps built. But you can also overinvest in it, right? There comes a point where it is comprehensive, it is easy to use, it covers all the capabilities. And there are more things you can do to improve it, but the return on that investment is going to plateau eventually over time. And there are actually quite a few examples like that. Another one is some of the enterprise tooling and readiness pieces we mentioned. If you don't have tooling for managing the requests that users make to their admins to use apps, or you don't have tooling that allows admins to understand the trustworthiness of developers, your app simply won't get used. But again, there comes a point where you've done enough, and investing more in that is going to have marginal returns. And then there are projects where actually you're unlocking whole new use cases, or you're creating whole new sets of incentives for developers, or you're creating whole new categories of apps and integrations that are potentially unlimited in the value they can generate. We try and obviously have a reasonable balance between the two. So we break those 4 areas down, and then we look at what are the sort of the big strategic bets, and what are the sort of hygiene factors that we need to cover, and try and make sure that we have a balance. As I mentioned before, that sort of making sure your funnel isn't leaking, a lot of that work is this hygiene type work. And only when you've addressed that can you really start to invest in some of the things that will really pull developers and users into using the platform. So it's kind of, we're going through that transition now, and that's sort of quite exciting.
Interesting. Yeah.
So,
I like the
so just to answer your question, like we'll map that out. Pick a responsible number of bets, right? Try not to do too much at once. And then we will actually put that into a narrative that helps us explain both to our own teams, but also the larger organization, why we feel these are the right things to do and on what time frame. Something it's worth mentioning, because I realize this may be unique, well, not unique, but not always common, is because of the stage Miro is at, the speed at which it's growing, our planning timeframes are normally around 6 months, 6 to 12 months at most. So we don't sort of, at least certainly within the platform, given that we're only a few years into the journey, we don't have like long-term roadmap planning. Certainly not. We have this like painted picture, as I mentioned, but we don't plan the roadmap specifically more than 6 months out. And so again, that's another reason why we update the strategy on a 6-monthly cadence, is because I'm sure you're more aware of this than anybody, but different people expect different things when you say the word strategy. And one of the mistakes I made early on when I was doing early strategy presentations is I would focus too much on the long-term opportunity and the long-term strategy for getting there. And I would get to the end of the presentation and people would say, well, that's very interesting, but what are you actually going to do? Like, what are you going to do now? You're in the next 6 months. So you have to sort of, how you package and communicate is so important. And one of those is to create the right balance between that longer term sense of direction and tangible product increments.
Perfect. So if I understand correctly, maybe to reflect this back to you, the narrative is the thing that put these big bets together in kind of painting the picture of why we are doing those.
Exactly, because again, this is a challenge that we face. Let's imagine you're in an organization like Miro, which is not. We talked earlier about platform as a product versus platform supports the product. In platform as a product businesses, then obviously everybody right up to the leadership understands platforms and understands the value of offering specific additional features to developers. Within our situation, where we're a platform that supports a product, the leadership are not spending all day, every day thinking about how can the platform evolve. They're not thinking about what new features do developers want. What they're thinking about is how do we evolve the core product in ways that expand our addressable market and acquire new customers. And so if I were to go to them and present a roadmap of developer features, saying we're going to platformize this capability, and we're going to add a new API for that, and we're going to create a new client library for this. They were just like, why does this, like, why? Like, why does this matter? How does this help us? And so, because of the nature of the business, we have to learn how to tell a story internally about why these capabilities and features will unlock new opportunities for developers and customers to build apps and integrations that will create value, for end users. And we have to do that through examples, case studies. Sometimes it's more of a mock-ups or like sort of hypothetical future applications that can be built. We have to get them excited about how we're evolving the art of the possible, right? Because the actual things on our roadmap are not in their language, right? And so that ability to tell that story is crucial for our ability to drive influence and to get support internally.
I think I was just kind of, this is a wild guess, but I think that also relates to the lagging indicators that we were talking before, because this feature that you're building now can bring this potential value in so many steps away that it's kind of hard to make this without a narrative.
Absolutely. And that comes back to what I was saying a minute ago, which is, our planning horizons are 6 to 12 months. And almost all of our roadmap planning is done on a 6-month basis. And that puts us in a very difficult position because we are talking about making changes where we cannot measure the impact within the time frame of a planning cycle, right? So if that's the case, then things like OKRs just break down, right? They just don't really work because we can't set goals that will respond in time to actually score. Again, we have to work a bit harder to tell the longer term story, to build confidence in the leadership that we are on the right direction, that we're moving in the right direction, because the more conventional tools we have to monitor that don't really apply well.
One final question about the process, though. You mentioned hey, we select a few of these big bets. How do you actually make that selection? So I understand that there is kind of the quadrants and the priority of the quadrants, but is there some sort of sizing or some sort of mechanism to prioritize bets?
It depends on where in the map it appears, as it were. So when you're looking at, if you're looking at the developer enablement, developer acquisition side, then you have reasonably responsive metrics, right? So you can ask reasonable questions about what do we see as the best opportunity to drive developer acquisition. And something I probably should have stressed a little more earlier, that again is something that we learned and that I have to work hard to sell internally, is the importance of go-to-market to platforms. Again, if you're working in an environment that's sort of more of a PLG motion, there's a belief that's baked into the culture that if you build great products, the users will be attracted to them. And I mean, to be fair to the whole company, our overall approach to growing the business has evolved dramatically over the last few years as we're becoming increasingly an enterprise vendor. And so now it's a blend of product-led growth and more conventional top-down sales. I've heard this described as like product-led sales. But at its heart, we still believe that great products, like high-quality experiences, will attract customers and users. Unfortunately for platforms, I once did a presentation on platform strategy where I started with a slide that just said, if you build it, they will not necessarily come. Because you really have to work hard to actually acquire developers, and you have to put in place very carefully considered go-to-market strategies, outreach strategies. You have to build a developer relations team. You have to go to events. You have to sponsor hackathons. You have to put in place incentives to acquire people. And so we can, again, if we're working in that part of the strategy, we can look at best practices from other providers. We assess opportunities based both on the outreach side. So is it worth participating in this conference, for example, or running a workshop there? And then on the product side, like where are the sharp edges in the onboarding process that we can remove? But further down the funnel, when you get into like the capabilities of the APIs, then you have to think about use cases. And that has been our kind of primary prioritization model for the APIs and SDKs, is not prioritizing features, but prioritizing use cases. So, to what extent are we going to invest in enabling apps that support project planning versus diagramming versus running workshops, and so on and so on and so on. And this is, again, heavily informed by the high-level company strategy. So we try not to diverge too heavily from that. And then again, similar thing on the user side, right? With acquisition, we have good data because it responds pretty quickly, and we can take a more conventional, kind of almost a B2C approach there. We have users, we have something to offer them, we want them to use it. Whereas when we look further down the funnel at conversion rates, then it's very, very data centric. It's like, okay, we absolutely understand where we're losing users through this process of acquiring and retaining them, and we will target our efforts based on where the biggest drop-offs are.
No, no. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And we're reaching our time limit, so I want to be cautious of that and ask you my typical ending question, which is, what's an important learning about the strategy that you had over the years, not only at Miro, that I didn't cover, we didn't cover, and you would like to share with the audience?
I think I touched on this very briefly, but I'm not going to lie. Strategy is something I've really struggled with in the past. I think, as I mentioned, in my early days, in my formative years in product, I didn't have to think too much about it. I was working in a massive organization with a lot of incredible technology. That it was so exciting to be able to put that technology in the hands of developers and just see what they did. I could do one of the most challenging projects I worked on while I was PM on the Maps API was introducing monetization and limits on usage, which, as you can imagine, was highly controversial, got me mentioned in news articles all over the world, and not in a good way, and was a real lesson to me in the importance of having a strategy and actually having a balanced value proposition. But my point is that until that point, we were just launching stuff. We didn't have any monetization. We didn't have to worry, right? It was only later that I started to really have to answer the question of what is your strategy. Someone who was actually a VP of product summed it up to me when I first ran into this roadblock. He said, "What is your strategy?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, what do we win if we win?" I said, it's an interesting way of thinking about it. It stuck with me. But my point is that it took me a while to really start to understand. And one of the things one of the reasons I struggled with it was because it means such different things to different people. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's you need to align on what people expect of a strategy before you start building a strategy. Otherwise, you can do a huge amount of work that doesn't have the impact that you're looking for because it's not what people are expecting of it. And that's something that we've spent quite a bit of time in my team now discussing. It's like, let's make sure that we're all aligned as to what a strategy is, so that when we come to the leadership and we present it, it meets their expectations of a strategy.
I love that because and this has not been mentioned before, but it's not like you want to, hey, I read Marty Kagan, and Marty Kagan says this is a strategy, so I will post a strategy. It's more about what the company needs in terms of strategy, and I think it's a very clever.
Yeah, and actually, just to wrap that thought up, it's funny. One of the, obviously, something we haven't talked about is more on the building teams and leading, leadership side, which is obviously a big part of my day-to-day these days. And one of the most common anti-patterns I see in young, relatively new product managers is exactly that frustration, is that they have read the books, they've read the literature, they've absorbed, the best practices, and now they're just, every day, they're just getting more and more frustrated that the rest of the organization hasn't, right? You can't put a copy of Inspired on the desk of every exec. You have to figure out, the one thing I say is we talk a lot about the importance of empathy in product management, and it's often in the context of empathizing with your customers and your users. But actually empathizing with your stakeholders and your colleagues is just as important. And that is equally true upwards as sideways, right? So I get, it upsets me when I see, people who are just kind of complaining about the leadership and what are they thinking, and they're just sat in their ivory towers. And they're like, have you actually talked to them? Do you understand who they are as people? Do you understand what they're trying to achieve, how their success is measured, what pressures they're under, what incentives they're under, right? You've got to understand things from their perspective. And then, believe it or not, in 99% of cases, they're rational actors, and their behavior will make sense, right? If you can get to that level of understanding, then you can present, you can have these conversations about like, what is it you need of us to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, and you can come back with a strategy that actually resonates with them.
Absolutely. This has been wonderful, Thor. Thank you so much for sharing all this expertise and your processes and everything. Where can people find you if you want to be found, or what any final place that they should be looking into?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not too hard to find. There aren't many people with my name. And I'm also on the app formerly known as Twitter. Again, at Thor Mitchell. That's probably the two best options right now.
Okay, thanks so much again for sharing everything, and hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks so much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of 100 Product Strategies, the podcast by Product Direction. You can also follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Instagram to get access to free weekly content that helps product people upgrade their skills and become more successful. You can access more material, promotional trainings, and be notified of every episode of the show with Product Direction's weekly newsletter. Join thousands of product leaders by registering in productdirection.co.